you look at the linebacker group, and then you're kind of continuing the front seven of the Bulldog defense, or front six, I suppose, in a 3-3-5. And it's obviously a very important group because you talk about Zach Arnett's defense and the way that they change the presentations and the different fronts that they're going to get in, the ways that they use linebackers as hybrids, notably that Sam linebacker spot between the defensive line and the linebacker room, the blitzes that they like to send, the different pressure looks that they like to send, the way they'll drop guys in and out. That whole unit is very intertwined. Obviously, defensive fronts are always intertwined on every defense. They always are going to be working together. But it's especially true in a defense like this. And it's a linebacker room that I think there's a good reason to have plenty of excitement about. And it was a solid group a season ago. When you look, Nick Mitchell had a really nice season for State. Kind of a guy that fully broke out and ended up 78 tackles, 5 tackles for loss, 2.5 sacks, had a couple quarterback hurries, had a fumble recovery, had an interception. A big year for him. And we'll always remember, you do not beat Arizona State if not for Nick Mitchell making that huge stuff on third down late in the fourth quarter of that game against the Sun Devils and holding Arizona State to a field goal. He made a massive, massive play there. And, you do lose a couple guys out of this room, Brandon Jennings and Malik Silla, as those guys rushing off the edge, and sort of that jack linebacker role that, now we call it a Sam linebacker in Zach Arnett's defense, who I was a little disappointed with Brandon Jennings, to be honest, this past season. Didn't feel like you got the highlight. 44 tackles on the year, but didn't have a tackle for loss. Did have 4 quarterback hurries, so he was able to get a little bit of pressure. But, Malik Silla was pretty productive for you. He led the team with 7 tackles for loss, had 5 quarterback hurries, 2 sacks. So, didn't turn a lot of those pressures into sacks. But, he was a guy that was able to give you some disruption up front. So, that's a loss. But otherwise, you bring back pretty much this whole room. Jalen Smith gave you 57 tackles last year at your transfer out of Tennessee. 3 quarterback hurries, 1.5 tackles for loss, a pass broken up. Zachary Tillman, a guy we were really, really excited about. And a really solid year. 47 tackles, 3 tackles for loss. He had a sack, a forced fumble, an interception, a couple quarterback hurries. That's a guy that sort of his billing is as a disruptor. And you saw a lot of that last year as a guy that can create some problems up front. Darian Golette was a little bit of a breakout player coming over from Texas with 38 tackles and 1.5 sacks on the season, and sort of factoring into that room. We didn't talk a lot about him throughout last offseason, and then you sort of to hear going into last fall, like, hey, no, this is a guy that's going to play quite a bit, and battled injuries a couple times, but still factored in. And then, of course, you talk about Tyler Lockhart, who was very impressive as a true freshman, and 34 tackles, didn't have a tackle for loss, only 2 quarterback hurries. Really was impressive, though. You go back to that Tennessee game where he sort of gets his first real significant action, and you saw why you're talking about a guy that was one of the top defensive players in the state of Mississippi going into last year, why it was such a big deal for State to get him in the class. Those core 4 guys are all back. And I think having those 4 guys as your inside backers returning in this room is plenty of reason to be excited about this group, because you've got a lot of experience back. Even if you're losing your top tackler, Nick Mitchell, you have a lot of experience back at those inside linebacker positions. So, the Mike and Will spots on this defense, and not to put those expectations on any of these guys, but we saw what Jet Johnson and Buki Watson were able to do playing as the Mike and Will linebackers within a Zach Arnett defense. Those guys are going to rack up tackles. They're going to rack up tackles for loss and pressures. That's how Zach Arnett wants to utilize those guys, is we're going to get them involved. We're going to blitz the crap out of them. And I think it fits what they can do. Specifically, when you talk about Tillman and Lockhart, Tillman is a guy, I've talked about it a lot, going back to the 2024 season. When he makes a play, it's a play that stands out. It's a negative play. He's getting in the backfield. He's batting down a pass. He's getting in the quarterback's face. It's either a sack, or he's making a tackle for loss, fumble force, fumble recovery, interception. The guy makes big negative plays. He's an aggressive player. Zach Arnett's going to use that and use that well. And then I look at Tyler Lockhart and just a guy who's really athletic. And I, flashed a little bit of that where, man, if you want to send him as a pass rusher, you can do that and he can do it well. I think that, again, you have a guy with that type of athleticism at the position, his talent ceiling. I think those two guys are going to be in for really, really big years. I'd probably nab them as your two starters right now with Tillman and Gillette behind them. But you feel really good about that group. Again, you got four guys that you can play that you feel confident putting them out there on the field that, hey, they're going to go and handle business. And again, with Zach Arnett leading the way, Matt Brock coaching that position again, you feel really excited about that group. And you don't have a ton of proven experience after that. Obviously, the guy people are going to be really excited to see if he can factor in more Fat Forrest. And the role he could play. Obviously, Tyler Lockhart's high school teammate. Does he get to factor in a little bit more now after being on campus a couple of years, taking his red shirt, and sort of just being a depth piece? What role can he play? Do you see a guy like AJ Rice as a redshirt freshman emerge a little bit? Obviously, this offseason, a chance for those guys to make some waves. And if you go back in time, you'll go back to like the 2022 season. So when Zach Arnett was previously here, State really only played four or five linebackers extensively, right? That's counting Tyrus Wheat at that Sam spot. Johnson and Watson barely left the field, and then Deshaun Page factored in quite a bit. Then J.P. Purvis had a little bit of a role. If you go back to 2021, kind of Aaron, it was Jet Johnson, Nathaniel Watson, Aaron Brule were kind of the guys. And then, Tyrus Wheat as well. You had to go all the way down to the number 19 tackler on the team for Sherman Timms as a linebacker who was getting involved. And I think he was doing so as I believe he was one of those pass rush spots. They didn't rotate linebackers quite a bit. So I think if they're going to continue that over, you're mostly looking at those top guys in the room. But I know those younger guys are players that there's been some excitement about how they could factor in and the type of guys they could be. So it will be interesting to see if, again, Fat Forrest, AJ Rice, if they can play a role here. And if you remember, look, State didn't sign a high school linebacker this year. There was the kid from, I'm blanking on his name, who ends up going to Tennessee. I know they pushed to make that happen because a player of his caliber, and it just would have been a nice recruiting win to get a 4-star player, top 5 player in the state in the class. TJ White, I believe is his name. But, it didn't happen. He ends up signing with the Vols. You were content, though, with what you had and what you had coming back. Now, transfer portal, they've, brought in a couple of guys. Gab Holman comes in for State. My understanding there is it's kind of the modern-day equivalent of a walk-on. They do have the kid coming in from Syracuse, but that's going to be obviously later on, and that's another guy who's sort of going to just be a depth piece. This group that we've talked about here, those are kind of your inside linebackers. That's who you're looking at leading the way in the room. The edge position is where it becomes a little bit more interesting, that Sam linebacker spot. Because when you talk about players returning on the roster, it's not a lot of obvious answers. Because like I said, if you go back to last year, you lose Brandon Jennings. You lose Malik Silla. I believe Neve Sanders kind of played that role as like the number 3 guy in that room. It may have been did Joseph Head do that a little bit? Yeah, I think Joseph Head may have played that some. All the guys who played that role, even in a slightly different defense, but it's essentially the same role, are gone from a season ago. And then when you look at the guys returning on the roster, there's not been a ton of true obvious, like, oh, yeah, that's who's stepping in to play that position because you just haven't seen it from them yet. I think Tyshawn Willis as a redshirt freshman, remember he was the top defensive player within the state of Mississippi when State signed him 2 years ago now. That's a guy that, I guess going into last season, that's a guy that, after taking a redshirt year, coming up from a lower level of high school football in Mississippi, how can he factor in? Is he going to be up to speed, be ready to contribute a little bit? That's going to be that's a guy who's supposed to help you as a pass rusher. That was sort of the billing coming out of high school. I think LaKendrick James is someone we've talked about at 6'2", 250. A guy who, redshirt junior year coming out of, Colin. Could he factor in a little bit more in that spot? And I do think sounds like he's probably playing this role. Based on a guy we'll talk about here in a second, Amari Williams had said in an interview the other day that James was someone that he was kind of working with in the room. So I'm assuming they're playing a similar spot, and it would make sense from a body style standpoint. But those are two guys who just haven't been on the field, haven't done it. The two players you're going to talk about the most, you start with Amari Williams, coming over from Florida State as a transfer. Let me get I know he's listed at 240. What is the 6'4", 240. Began his career at Florida State, splitting time over 2 seasons between the tight end and defensive end spots, and kind of showed flashes at both. And there were sort of questions over where would be the better spot to develop him. And I think the long-term answer is they feel is defensive end, where they think he flashed a little bit more. See if I can pull up his numbers from when he was at FSU last season. So last year for the Noles, as a tight end, he had 2 catches for 51 yards and a touchdown. Defensively, though, 10 tackles, 2 tackles for loss, 1.5 sacks, did have a quarterback hurry. Go back to 2024, caught 2 touchdowns as a true freshman in 8 games played, and really basically just played tight end. So this past year was sort of where they started to factor him in more as a defensive lineman. Felt he could be more of a contributor in that spot. I always go back to a quote Mike Leach had about the tight end spot, because he would always be asked about playing tight end in his offense and why he didn't use them. And he would always say, well, I'd like to have a tight end, but if I'm going to have a tight end, I need a true tight end. And God didn't make too many true tight ends. And the ones he did, a lot of them were playing defensive end. And what he meant by that is the guys that have the combination of size, athleticism, and power that is necessary to play a true tight end, and not just be a guy who's a big slot receiver, not just be a guy who is essentially a fullback, be a true tight end. A lot of those guys get developed as defensive linemen, because that's where it's a little bit more valuable to have those guys for most teams coming up through the high school ranks. And then when you talk about getting to the second level, the premium put on the pass rushers, those guys get developed in that way. You're kind of seeing an example of that here with Amari Williams, a guy that had the athleticism to play as tight end, but also has the size, and you think the traits like, hey, this guy would probably help us out more if we put him on the edge and told him to get after the quarterback. And that's clearly what State is banking on, and Zach Arnett is banking on, that this guy can step in and is going to be a big-time impact player for State off the edge. And we haven't seen it yet from a production standpoint, just a few flashes out there. I definitely would like to go and look more, his time at Florida State to get a little bit of a better idea of what we saw there or what he showed there. But it does speak highly of him. I've talked about it a lot. The Caleb Herring, Harvey Dyson thing, that State did not heavily pursue those transfers. When those guys have more proven production out there, and clearly State and Arnett question whether or not that production is reflective of a guy that's worth being paid starter money for a defensive end in the SEC, or an edge rusher in the SEC, because they think we've got a guy who can give us that in Amari Williams. There's high expectations on him because of that, for sure. That puts high expectations on him. Obviously, if it doesn't work out, then everything we've talked about, sort of the questioning State's approach to the portal this year, it comes out, because it's such an important spot in Arnett's defense. Yes, all the other positions, every linebacker needs to be a guy who's a good blitzer, needs to be a guy who can be good in coverage, needs to be good in run support, all of those things. But the edge position specifically, that's a guy who, we need him to be able to rush one-on-one off the edge. We also want to be able to drop him back into the flat and have him be able to play in coverage. We need to be able to hold up and run support. That's a big thing. So you've got to set the edge, which is something State could not do last year. Teams that wanted to go and just run a bunch of outside zone, pin and pull type schemes against State's defense, if they were good at those schemes, they had a ton of success against Mississippi State because State's edge rushers would just get knocked off the ball and they'd get sealed off. You got to have a guy who can hold up against that. Tyrus Wheat was able to do that. Can Amari Williams be that guy for Mississippi State? That's going to be the big question for him. And then there's the freshman, Micah Nickerson, who was obviously a massive recruiting win for State. When you talk about a guy that was sort of this under-the-radar hidden gem whose recruitment started to take off, he flips to Missouri, and it's like, okay, well, crap, there we go. But we sort of hear, hey, State's not out of this. Like, they're still firmly in the race. They're going to make a push, and they find a way to flip him back just before signing day. I think this was on signing day, and get him signed to be the Bulldogs. And definitely had to do some work. Had to do some work in the NIL market to make it happen. But they get a guy like that on campus who, when it was all said and done, ended up on Rivals as a top 50 player in the class nationally, as a high 4-star prospect. And this is a guy that it's big-time raw athleticism, get after the quarterback. Has to refine that. That was sort of the big thing you look on the scouting report. Is this a guy that probably would need a year of development or so, but is a really good athlete off the edge. Played receiver as well. I think receiver and tight end in high school because he's got that athleticism. The big thing that stands out with him is the weight, because he was listed coming out of high school as like 215. He's on the roster at 250 now. And Jeff Lebby did say when he was interviewed in spring practices, he's like, Nickerson up above 250, 255 range. I don't know how you put on that much weight that fast and do so in a way that is, the best for you. And that's not me being suspicious. I don't know clearly I don't know the bodybuilding side of things, but they got his weight up to a point where, like, at 250, yeah, man, you can play that spot. That's a good range to be in. And just from a body physicality standpoint, you should be able to contend against an SEC tackle in the run game. It's not really a concern about being a pass rusher, because I think he's going to have the athleticism, and hopefully he didn't, they kept that while still being able to put on the weight. That's the other big part about it. Does he keep the same bend and the same burst off the edge? But you feel like you can put him out there, and it's not just going to be a case where he gets, knocked away every single play. But even if that's only a guy who can give you reps as a pass rusher, like, hey, third down, and clear up like obvious passing situation, put him in, pin your ears back, go get the quarterback. State hasn't had a guy like that on the roster for multiple seasons. They've not had a guy they could trust to do that. So if Nickerson can play that role, that is a massive benefit for State, for sure. So that's a guy that there's a lot of excitement about. They've got to, Sam, they need at least one guy to truly emerge. It's probably Amari Williams. I'd put Nickerson second right now. And then you talk about Tyshawn Willis, LaKendrick James. Can one of those guys do it? There had been talk about moving, a Darian Gillette or a Ty Lockhart over, but I think they feel good enough about Amari Williams. And I think there's probably some bud with Nickerson putting on the weight. They probably feel pretty good about what they have there, that you don't have to move those guys from the inside linebacker spots and out to the edge. You can keep them inside. If you get somebody to emerge at that spot, this linebacker room is going to be top to bottom really, really good for Mississippi State.